Good evening, friends. This evening session is dedicated to class 11, and we are going to have a revisional assignment, a revisional discussion of the fourth poem, Childhood, by Marcus Nutton. The very first thing that you'd like to ask, sir, what is this poem, Childhood, all about? Well, the poem Childhood is all about the poet's obsession with the loss of his childhood. The poet is completely obsessed with the loss of his childhood. He is totally, is totally lost in the discussion about how and when his childhood was lost. Loss of childhood and stepping into adulthood is a gradual process. Yes, a gradual process. The poem describes the growth of individuality, rationalism, and the ability to see through the hypocrisy of the grown-ups as the sign of being adult. And he believes that if one is able to distinguish between reality and fiction and see through the hypocrisy of the grown-ups, one one is at the doorstep of adulthood. One has lost his childhood, and one is very much at the doorstep of adulthood. And that is the reason why the poet talks about all these steps of attaining adulthood. The poet says, the poet himself understands that he has been obsessed with the loss of his childhood. He wants to know exactly when he lost his childhood. He makes different speculations regarding his loss of childhood. As he is obsessed with the loss of his childhood, he is undergoing lot of speculation. He realizes that the process of attaining adulthood and the loss of childhood is a gradual process. It involves different stages of growth. Rationality also is one of the signs of attaining adulthood. The poet makes a guess that it was at that age of 11 when he started thinking like an, a rational human being. He realized that hell and heaven were just imaginations. They were in the mind of one's individual. They were just in the mind, and they were the imagination of the mind of an individual. They didn't really exist. Hell and heaven didn't really exist in the real world. They were just the imaginary concepts, and therefore the poet was able to see through the reality and fiction. He was able to make a differentiation, or he was able to differentiate between truth and imagination, reality and fiction. And the third thing that the poet perhaps realized regarding his loss of childhood was that he was able to see through the hypocrisy of the adults. The adults preach love, but in practicality they don't practice it. So the poet started, seeing through the hypocrisy of the adulthood, and was able to realize that what the adult preach, they never practice. They never practice. What they preach, they never practice. And then what happened, that at last the poet came to know that actually he is able to develop independent thinking. He is able to think independently, and he is not influenced, his mind is not influenced by anybody, or neither it is directed by anybody else. And then he came to realize that actually he has lost his childhood. So when the poet has developed his individuality, he came to realize that he is no more a child. Perhaps he has lost his childhood. So in the final stanza, the poet asks again the same question: when did his childhood go? Where did his childhood go? The last stanza he is making the question. In the beginning he asked when did he lose his childhood, but in the last stanza his question is little changed. He asks where did his childhood go, and then he comes to conclude that perhaps his childhood has disappeared on the face of a newly born child. He has completely forgotten the place where his childhood has gone, and then he comes to conclude that Perhaps his lost childhood can be seen on the face of an infant. Now the textual questions, which are really important. Let us talk about the textual questions. Yeah, the very first question. Let us now divide the entire poem into three concepts. The first stanza number one, talks about rationalism, that the poet is able to, develop his rational thinking, his logical thinking. He is able to distinguish between truth and fiction, reality and imagination, and that is what we call rationalism. So the first stanza talks about rationalism. What does the second stanza talks about? The second stanza talks about hypocrisy, when the poet is able to see through the hypocrisy of the grown up. That means he is able to understand that the adults preach something else but they practice something else. They do not have any correlation in what they preach and what they practice. And the third stanza talks about individuality, that the poet has developed independent thinking. He is not being influenced by anybody's decision and he can think independently. And that is when he realizes that he has now lost his childhood. The second question is, what according to the poem is involved in the process of growing up? Yeah, in the process of growing up, there are many steps involved. First of all, it begins with the idea when one can differentiate between reality and imagination. As soon as the poet starts differentiating between reality and imagination, he understands that perhaps he has lost his childhood. And then the second step is that when he is able to differentiate between reality and fiction. And the third step is that when he is able to think independently and is not being influenced by anybody's decision. This is how he realizes that he has grown to be an adult, because he has gone through this gradual process of growth. And the growth is that he has been able to distinguish between truth and reality, truth and fiction. He has been able to differentiate between, or to see through the hypocrisy of the adulthood, and he has been able to develop an independent thinking. So in the process of growth, three important things develops in any human being. The first one is that rationalism. He is able to distinguish or differentiate between reality and fiction. The second thing, that he is able to see through the hypocrisy of the adulthood. And the third thing, that he is able to develop an independent thinking. Now the third question, what is the poet's feeling towards childhood? Well, the poet seems to be nostalgic about his childhood. He is very much obsessed with the loss of his childhood, and therefore he seems to be nostalgic with his childhood. It has been lost and it will never come back. So he seems to suffer from a sense of loss. Next question, that is the last question. Which do you think are the most poetic lines and why? The most poetic lines are the following. It went to some forgotten place that is hidden to an infant's face. These two lines are rhyming couplets, and hence they lift us from the innocence of the infant, where the poet's childhood seems to be lying. So these two lines are quite poetic. And the last question of the day, what does the poet say about the hypocrisy of the grown up? The poet says that the grown up preach something else but they don't actually practice. They often preach about love, but in practicality they never practice it. So they are just a hypocrite. The grown ups are just a hypocrite. They never practice what they preach. And the grown ups, that is why the grown ups appear to be something different, but in the real sense they are quite different. They don't practice love, but they always preach about love. So that is how we come to conclude the lesson. The in the this poem childhood, there are three important characteristics that the poet is discussing about. The first one is rationalism, that the poet says that he has completely been obsessed with the loss of his childhood, and he understands that perhaps he is now able to differentiate between, reality and fiction. That means he has developed rationalism. Second thing that he says, that in the process of growth and is stepping into adulthood, he is able to see through the hypocrisy of the adults. What the adults preach, they never practice. That is what we call hypocrisy of the grown up. And the third important thing in the process of growth of the poet is that he has developed the capacity of independent thinking. He no more depends upon any other's decisions or any other's mind. He can think independently and take a decision of his own, and that is what we call individuality. So rationalism, individuality, and seeing through the hypocrisy of the adulthood are the three important characteristics which help the poet to make it sure that he is no more a child. He has lost his childhood and he has perhaps stepped into the world of adulthood. That is what I wanted to conclude with.